It began with a quiet, almost unnoticeable question, so subtle that most of the staff inside that sprawling Montecito mansion nearly missed it. Doria Ragland, often portrayed as the steady anchor behind the Sussex brand, leaned in one afternoon and asked something that reportedly made a long-time employee pause. She didn't ask about schedules or PR strategies. Instead, she quietly wondered what Archie and Lily were actually like, admitting she had never truly spent time with them. The weight of that statement lingered. A grandmother, someone expected to be central to a growing family, confessing she felt like a stranger to her own grandchildren. This wasn't just a simple family matter or a case of conflicting schedules. That single remark seemed to open the door to deeper speculation. Rumors tied to what some have called the 2026 victim Markle leak suggest that the public narrative of recent years may have been carefully constructed, leading toward a dramatic moment of isolation. Reports even claim that Doria had reached her limit and was preparing to leave for good. Her departure, if true, would not simply be personal. It would signal the unraveling of a carefully maintained image. When even those within the inner circle begin to question something as fundamental as the presence of children, it raises unsettling doubts about the story that has been presented publicly. One individual who reportedly lived and worked inside the mansion for months eventually decided to speak out. According to her account, what stood out most was not what she witnessed, but what she didn't. Her observations challenge everything many believed about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. She described entering the $14 million home each morning expecting the usual signs of life: coffee brewing, a television humming in the background, or the small traces of a rushed breakfast. Instead, she said the house felt empty, almost like a vacuum. There was no sense of lived-in warmth. Every room was immaculate, but in a clinical, almost unnatural way. Cushions were perfectly aligned, surfaces gleamed as if untouched, and nothing ever seemed out of place. Despite working long hours and moving through every hallway and room, she felt as though she was inside a staged environment rather than a family home. In most households, especially those with young children, there is a natural chaos: magazines left open, shoes by the door, or glasses left half full on a bedside table. Here, however, everything appeared frozen in time, as though each space had been prepared for display rather than daily living. What unsettled her most was the silence. In a home with children, silence is rare. There are usually echoes of laughter, footsteps, toys clattering, or distant cries. But inside this mansion, she described an absolute stillness. She would pause in the hallways, listening carefully for any sign of activity from the nursery wing. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months, yet that silence never broke. Passing by what were said to be the children's rooms gave her a strange, uneasy feeling. There were no toys scattered around, no baby gates, no drawings on the refrigerator, none of the usual signs of young children. Even the air in those areas felt stale, as though the rooms had not been used regularly. At first, she wondered if she had simply missed the times when the children were active. But regardless of her schedule, from early morning to late evening, the result remained the same. The house felt as though something essential was missing. It wasn't just privacy. It was an absence so noticeable that staff members began quietly exchanging glances, silently asking each other if they were noticing the same thing. They say laundry reveals the truth about daily life. It's one of the few things that cannot be staged. And, according to this account, that's where the story became even more puzzling. The maid recalled a conversation with the household's laundry worker, someone experienced in managing garments for high-profile families. One afternoon, the worker reportedly confided, while cautiously glancing at security cameras, that she had never once washed children's clothing during her time there. That detail stood out. In a home with 2 young children, there would normally be endless loads of laundry, tiny socks, pajamas, bibs, and blankets needing constant washing. Yet none of that appeared. Instead, the laundry consisted entirely of adult items: designer outfits, crisp shirts, yoga wear, and fine linens. The absence of children's clothing left the worker confused, even unsettled, as it didn't match what she had experienced in other family households. The complete absence of child-sized items felt like a logistical impossibility. It was as though the children didn't exist within the physical reality of the house. There were no traces left behind, no evidence in fabrics, no signs in daily routines. Their presence, if real, seemed invisible, like something that left no imprint on the space around it. While the laundry room revealed a lack of clothing, the hallways suggested an absence of movement. No signs of children ever passing through. During this time, the maid was working in the house while the public narrative claimed that Meghan Markle was pregnant with her second child. The world saw glowing photographs, a carefully cradled belly, and stories of a mother preparing for a new arrival. But inside the home, the reality appeared very different. The maid saw Meghan up close every day, far from cameras and public appearances. According to her observations, she never noticed any visible baby bump. Instead, she described Meghan moving with a level of speed and agility that didn't align with someone in the later stages of pregnancy. She watched her reach for items on high shelves, bend down to pick things up, and move through tight spaces with ease, without the subtle shifts in balance typically associated with pregnancy. Beyond that, there were no signs of preparation within the home. There were no prenatal vitamins on counters, no specialized pillows, no discussions about doctor visits, and no visible nursery preparations. When staff members quietly spoke among themselves, it wasn't out of malice, it was confusion. They were witnessing a version of reality that didn't match the public narrative. Inside the house, there were none of the physical or emotional indicators of pregnancy, while outside, magazines and media told an entirely different story. This contrast created a sense of disorientation among the staff, as if they were experiencing two conflicting realities at once. This is where the so-called 2026 victim arc leak enters the picture, offering a possible explanation for the unusual atmosphere within the home. Alleged internal documents suggest that 2026 was planned as a turning point, a shift toward a narrative centered on isolation. According to these claims, the strategy involved presenting Prince Harry as someone who had sacrificed everything, not only his family in the UK, but also his peace and social standing, for a life that was ultimately unraveling. For such a narrative to succeed, the public could not see a lively, happy household. Instead, the image needed to reflect solitude, a man alone in a vast, empty home. The reported absence of the children from public view, along with the seemingly staged environment of the house, was described as a deliberate effort to build a sense of mystery and eventual tragedy. If the goal was to evoke sympathy in the future, it would require years of carefully constructed distance from normal life. In that context, the emptiness of the home wasn't a failure. It was part of a larger setup for a future revelation. However, the same claims point to a major complication. Doria was not expected to leave at this stage. Her reported departure has, according to these accounts, disrupted the entire narrative. As someone positioned close to the family, she was seen as a key witness to their reality. Without her presence, the carefully maintained image begins to weaken. The house no longer appears simply private, it appears exposed. Maintaining such a level of secrecy would require more than trust. It would demand strict control. According to the maid, the security measures inside the Montecito mansion resembled something out of a spy novel. Each morning, before she could even begin her work, she was required to surrender her phone. It would be locked away and guarded until the moment she left for the day, ensuring that nothing from inside the house could be recorded or shared. There were no exceptions, no smartwatches, no recording devices, not even a notebook. Staff members were effectively cut off from the outside world for up to 12 hours at a time. But the surveillance wasn't only about controlling what came into the house, it was also about monitoring everything happening inside it. The maid noticed that the security cameras were not focused on the perimeter to guard against intruders. Instead, they were aimed inward. They tracked the hallways, observed staff as they worked, and monitored interactions between employees. It didn't feel like protection, it felt like scrutiny, as though the goal was to catch any sign of curiosity. One worker was reportedly reprimanded simply for pausing too long while looking at a photograph on a mantelpiece. The message was unmistakable: "Do your job, but don't question anything." Yet, the stricter the environment became, the more it seemed to invite curiosity about what was being concealed. There was one night, however, when the controlled silence broke. The maid was finishing her routine in the kitchen when a sudden burst of voices shattered the stillness. These weren't the polished, composed tones seen in media appearances. They were sharp, intense, and filled with tension. She recognized Meghan's voice first, quick, precise, and cutting. But what truly unsettled her was the sound of Prince Harry. Harry didn't sound like a prince, nor even like an equal in the conversation. He sounded exhausted, like someone worn down emotionally. When she briefly caught sight of them through a doorway, she saw him sitting at a table, head in his hands, shoulders slumped in defeat. He wasn't arguing. He seemed to be asking for a moment of peace. Nearby stood Marcus Anderson, appearing to manage the situation, not as a casual observer, but almost like someone directing a tense scene. The atmosphere in the room felt heavy, charged with a kind of pressure that was impossible to ignore. In that moment, the maid realized that the image being presented to the world, a calm, perfect life, felt completely at odds with what she was witnessing. To her, it seemed less like a peaceful home and more like a controlled, high-pressure environment. The silence that followed the argument was even heavier than before. It wasn't just quiet. It felt final, as though something beneath the surface had cracked. This brings attention to one of the most questioned aspects of the Sussex narrative, the house itself. When their multi-million-dollar Netflix documentary was released, the maid watched it, expecting to recognize the spaces she had spent months cleaning. Instead, she felt confused. The home shown on screen didn't match the one she knew. The details were different, the wood finishes, the layout, the way light entered the rooms. Even the garden, where children were shown playing, didn't resemble the grounds of the Montecito estate. Analysts have since suggested that portions of the footage may have been filmed in a separate property, reportedly a high-value mansion rented specifically for production. This raises a difficult question. If a life is truly private and authentic, why present it through a different setting? Why stage personal moments in a place that isn't your actual home? For the maid, this realization tied everything together: the absence of children, the lack of everyday evidence, and the possibility of staged environments. It pointed, in her view, to a version of reality that felt constructed rather than lived. But the silence inside the house wasn't just something you noticed. It was something you were expected to respect. She recalled a specific incident involving a contractor brought in to fix a lighting issue in what was described as the children's wing. Unlike the regular staff, he was an outside professional, experienced in working within high-security, private homes. However, before he could even begin his work, he was approached by a 3-person security team, an interaction that made it clear this was no ordinary job. They didn't just check his ID, they gave him a list of restrictions so strict it left him stunned. He was instructed to keep his eyes on the floor while walking through certain hallways. If he heard a voice, he was to stop immediately and face the wall. When he finally reached the nursery to fix the lighting, he expected the usual signs of a child's room, perhaps a designer crib, a rocking chair, or shelves filled with toys. Instead, he later confided to a friend that the space looked as though it had been staged for a real estate showing that very morning. The room felt cold. The vents were closed, and there wasn't a single personal item in sight. No family photos, no scent of baby products, not even something as ordinary as a diaper in the bin. He described the experience as deeply unsettling, saying it felt less like a nursery and more like an empty display. The atmosphere affected him so strongly that he rushed through the job in half the expected time and left as quickly as possible. Later, he admitted that despite working for some of the most eccentric billionaires in Silicon Valley, he had never encountered a space that felt so devoid of life. To him, it didn't feel like a room meant for a child, it felt hollow. If questions still remain about the reality of the Sussex household, the daily logistics raise even more. Consider something as simple as groceries. In any home with young children, the shopping list is constant: milk, snacks, fruit, and the small items that seem to disappear as soon as they're stocked. However, the staff member responsible for managing grocery orders for the Montecito household described something entirely different. Over more than a year, the orders remained consistent and entirely adult-focused. The kitchen was stocked with items like premium green juices, organic produce, expensive wines, and lean proteins. There were no orders for baby formula, no packaged purees, no child-friendly snacks. Not once did staples like crackers, milk, or simple comfort foods appear in the inventory. In a home with 2 young children, these items would normally be unavoidable. Yet, according to the records, they simply weren't there. When questions were raised about whether the children had separate arrangements, the response was always dismissive. The data painted a clear picture, a household tailored to 2 health-conscious adults and a rotating staff, but no visible trace of children's needs. And so, everything circles back to the beginning. To Doria, to the speculation surrounding the 2026 narrative, to the silent hallways and untouched rooms. On their own, each detail might seem unusual, but together, they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. It suggests a carefully controlled environment, one where appearances may not fully align with what happens behind closed doors. If those working inside the home, those who see Prince Harry and Meghan Markle away from cameras and public appearances, cannot point to any clear signs of children, it naturally raises questions. Are the children being protected with an extraordinary level of privacy? Or is the image presented to the public part of a larger, carefully managed narrative? With Doria reportedly stepping away and staff beginning to speak, the situation appears to be shifting. The sense of mystery surrounding the Montecito mansion is no longer subtle. It's becoming increasingly difficult to overlook. So now the question remains, is this an extreme example of privacy taken to its limits, or something more constructed? Does the rumored 2026 narrative explain the silence, or is there still more beneath the surface? What do you think?